traguardo quello di aver tradotto questo libro in Italia. Siamo la prima lingua latina ad averlo tradotto, con noi un altro paese che ha tradotto sono i tedeschi, gli austriaci in realtà, quindi siamo i secondi al mondo ad avere questo libro tradotto. Celebriamo questo momento dopo 2 anni di lavoro, è un'associazione quello che l'ha fatto, non è una casa editrice famosa, ma è un gruppo di ragazzi che si sono riuniti e attraverso una raccolta fondi hanno chiesto alla comunità italiana di riuscire a produrre questo libro. Ce l'abbiamo fatta, siamo riusciti a tradurlo in 2 anni di tempo. Non abbiamo nemmeno noi rispettato i tempi che avevamo a disposizione, perché avremmo dovuto farlo nell'arco di 1 anno, ma ce ne abbiamo impiegati 2, però il volume, diciamo, parla da sé, i contenuti sono contenuti tecnico-scientifici, quindi abbiamo avuto tutta una serie di problematiche durante la traduzione. Oggi abbiamo la possibilità di conoscere 2 persone che hanno segnato la mia vita, ma continuano a segnare la vita di tante persone nella diffusione di quello che è il movimento della permacultura. Avremo, vabbè, lo sappiamo, abbiamo Rhamis la mattina, adesso iniziamo con un'introduzione alla permacultura. Rhamis è un docente internazionale che ha lavorato con Jeff Lawton in Australia ed è il primo docente a cui io mi sono approcciato quando mi sono approcciato alla permacultura. Abbiamo sempre utilizzato nei corsi che abbiamo organizzato docenti stranieri, perché sono loro che hanno sempre utilizzato questo libro come libro di testo per l'insegnamento della permacultura. Nel pomeriggio poi invece abbiamo Jeff Lawton, che dopo Bill Mollison è colui che si è preoccupato di diffondere in maniera virale la permacultura nel mondo, e lo ha fatto avendo il vantaggio di poter utilizzare internet, cosa che Bill Mollison al tempo negli anni 80 non aveva, quindi un processo che per Bill è stato lento ed è stato in un certo senso costretto a viaggiare, conoscere le persone, quindi la permacultura nel mondo ha avuto una diffusione iniziale grazie a lui e continuata poi con Jeff Lawton, che incontreremo oggi pomeriggio. Io non vorrei aggiungere nient'altro, partiamo con l'introduzione della permacultura e lascio la parola a Rhamis, che è colui che si occuperà dell'introduzione.
Ciao, buongiorno. My name is Rhamis Kent, and I am currently serving as the co-director of an organization called the Permaculture Research Institute. I work along with Jeff Lawton, the gentleman that Ignacio was talking about, and he'll be coming here to speak this afternoon. Jeff was my teacher a little less than 10 years ago, and I think similarly, as Ignacio said, he had a major impact on my life and my outlook and understanding sort of the nature of the world, how it works, how history has worked, how our role as human beings functions, how it works. And I think this is probably one of the central points, and I think main features of what permaculture provides us with is a way of thinking about ourselves as human beings and how we function in the world in a very different way that I think many of us have been taught or trained to think about ourselves. I think this is probably one of the more important aspects of understanding how permaculture is defined and understanding the real power and value of what permaculture has to offer us. So this morning, I'd like to spend some time introducing permaculture to those of you who are not familiar with it, provide a working definition, and then perhaps give you some examples of how permaculture is sort of deployed or used in the world. But I want to provide some context I think this is very important in properly defining permaculture, is that we have to contextualize what problem, or what is it seeking to address. So this is something that was brought into being to address a set of issues, sort of chronic dilemmas, chronic challenges that have faced people throughout history. And it has attempted to put forward a set of solutions that will allow us to be able to meet those challenges in an effective manner. So I'll begin with a working definition. And this is something that is taken directly from the Permaculture Designer's Manual, the book that each of you have in your lap. I believe most of you at least have it in your lap. So permaculture is really a term, a word that is formed from two words. So permanent and agriculture. Right, so permaculture, or permanent agriculture, is the practical, conscious design and maintenance of agriculturally productive ecosystems which have the diversity, stability, and resilience of natural ecosystems. It is the harmonious integration of landscape and people, providing for their food, energy, shelter, and other material and non-material needs in a sustainable way. Now, the whole idea behind the development of agriculture is that if you, permanent agriculture, excuse me, is that if you can create a permanent agriculture, you can create a permanence in human culture. I'll say it again. If you can create a permanence in agriculture, you can create a permanence in human culture. Because one of the main features as to why human history is what it is, or has progressed in the manner that it has, is because of the way in which people have been unable to sort of broker or create a mutually beneficial partnership with the places in which they found themselves living. So because we have tended to misuse or mismanage the resources in the areas that large concentrations of people have gathered in over an extended period of time, we found it necessary to move from region to region in order to meet the needs of these populations. So a great deal of what we understand about history and the events that have marked human history, which would include everything from, again, warfare, chronic disease, wealth inequality, the whole history of sort of feudalism, slavery, all of these things are a consequence of this challenge that people have found in their ability or inability to be able to utilize resources to create a life for themselves. So I think one of the interesting things that Bill had said in sort of his thinking about this problem, and this is, again, this is Bill Mollison, if you've never seen him before. Permaculture was developed in the early 1970s, and it really grew out of many of the countercultural movements that had occurred during the 60s. One of which was rooted in the environmental crisis, the emerging environmental crisis that really came out of the expanding establishment of industrialization as the basis for most economies. So he said here that in the early 1970s, it dawned on me that no one had ever applied design to agriculture. When I realized it, the hairs went up on the back of my neck. It was so strange. We'd had agriculture for 7,000 years, and we'd been losing for 7,000 years. Everything was turning into desert. So I wondered, can we build systems that obey ecological principles? We know what they are, we just never apply them. I think that's a very interesting, excuse me, it's a very interesting statement, is the fact that you have the information necessary to be able to do things properly. But for one reason or another, we're not able to utilize the information properly. So he continues, ecologists never apply good ecology to their gardens. Architects never understand the transmission of heat in buildings. And physicists live in houses with demented energy systems. It's curious that we never apply what we know to how we actually live, which is a profound statement. So I think one of the things that you come to realize is the problem is not lack of information. The problem is having the ability and or the willingness to actually act on the information. So there's this gap between the two. Now, is there a way in which we can create, again, as he said, a system or methodology that allows for us to be able to utilize the information in a way that is able to produce as much benefit as possible, and specifically with regard to agriculture, because agriculture is actually one of the which is arguably the main driver in defining what has occurred throughout the course of human history. So just to continue with the definition. So the second part of this, he says that permaculture as a design system attempts to integrate fabricated, natural, spatial, temporal, social, and ethical parts or components to achieve a functional whole. To do so, it concentrates not on the components themselves, but on the relationships between them and on how they function to assist each other. It is the arrangement of parts that design has its being and function, and it is the adoption of a purpose which decides the direction of design. So I think there are a number of ideas that are contained within that definition. I think that one of the most important ones is the fact that it's not necessarily concerned about the use of singular components or singular elements that may be used in the design. The idea is that you have to create relationships between the pieces that you are bringing into the design. You have to find a way to make best use of each component by connecting them in the best manner possible. So in a way, it's like building a body. So the way that your body functions is not the product of a haphazard or random assembly of parts. It's very, very well considered. The reason why your body works the way that it does is because it is functionally optimized. It is functionally optimized. The way that all of the organs and your limbs, the way your anatomy is connected, is done so in a very considered way. Otherwise, you would not get this result. And so similarly, in attempting to create a design system that is able to produce a very similar result, you are also wanting to understand how you have a set of principles, you have a set of guidelines that allows for you to create something that produces the same outcome, that can maximize benefit and minimize harm. In going back and understanding this as a historical phenomenon, I'd like to look at a quote from a prominent American farmer and poet who some of you may be familiar with. His name is Wendell Berry, and he's written a number of books and he has a number of writings that are specifically focused on agriculture, and he really looks at this in a very profound manner, in a very philosophical way. And he addresses this issue of land abuse, the destruction of landscapes. And again, historically, the way that human beings have destroyed landscapes has, interestingly enough, been through agriculture. So he begins, if we are concerned about land abuse, then we must see that this is an economic problem, that the destruction and degradation of land is an economic problem. Every economy is, by definition, a land-using economy, meaning every economy needs to have a base of natural resources from which to create an economy. If we are using our land wrongly, then something is wrong with our economy. This is difficult. It becomes more difficult when we realize or recognize that in modern times, each one of us is a member of the economy of everybody else. Meaning, we live in an age defined by globalization. So everyone is connected to everyone else, whether or not we like it. It is something that has to be recognized. And it has its consequences, its good points and its challenges. But if we are concerned about land abuse, we have begun a profound work of economic criticism. Study the history of land use, and any local history will do, informs us that we have had for a long time an economy that thrives by undermining its own foundations. Now he really starts to get to the point. Industrialism. Industrialism, which is the name of our economy now, and which is now virtually the only economy of the world, has been from its beginnings in a state of riot. It is based squarely upon the principle of violence toward everything on which it depends. And it has not mattered whether the form of industrialism was communist or capitalist or whatever, meaning that there's this false dichotomy that we're often told about how communism and capitalism or socialism, or what have you, that these are somehow different things, when functionally they operate on the same principle. Right? They operate on the same principle. These are systems that in which you have arguments about who enjoys the spoils or who gets the benefits that's produced from that system. But functionally, they operate on the same principle. The violence toward nature, human communities, traditional agricultures, and local economies has been constant. The bad news is coming in literally from all over the world. Now here's where permaculture, the concept, the idea, can present us with another set of possibilities. So the proper business of a human economy is to make one whole thing of ourselves and this world. To make ourselves into a practical wholeness with the land under our feet is maybe not altogether possible. How would we know? But as a goal, it at least carries us beyond hubris, beyond arrogance, beyond the utterly groundless assumption that we can subdivide our present great failure into 1,000 separate problems that can be fixed by 1,000 task forces of academic and bureaucratic specialists. That program has been given more than a fair chance to prove itself, and we ought to know by now that it won't work. Now this criticism, this critique, the point that's being made here is that we have to start thinking of the way in which we design the systems that we rely on to create a life for ourselves, not in separate silos. But again, you have to think about it like a body. It has a functional whole, and understanding how each portion of the system affects the other parts. So in understanding as a species, as human communities, what is it that we in fact need in order to make a life for ourselves? So here he addresses that. He says we need a continuous supply of uncontaminated water, for example. Therefore, we need, among other things, soil and water conserving ways of agriculture and forestry that are not dependent on monoculture, toxic chemicals, or the indifference and violence that always accompany big-scale industrial enterprises on the land. Therefore, we need diversified, small-scale land economies that are dependent on people. Therefore, we need people with the knowledge, skills, motives, and attitudes required by diversified, small-scale land economies. And all this is clear and comfortable enough until we recognize the question we have come to. Where are the people? Where are the people that have the knowledge, the skills, the motives, and the attitudes that are required in order to produce the outcome that he's mentioned here? And really the creation of permaculture, the development of permaculture, is an attempt to create those people that can create or build the systems that are able to produce a very different outcome than what we've seen up to this point. Okay. Does that make sense? Just want to make sure. Is everybody okay, good. Don't be afraid to speak up if I'm not making sense. I'm from New York, so you have to can be very demonstrative. All right. So I think another point made by Bill Mollison, and again defining permaculture really as a functional reality, as a practical reality. And this is another definition that I think is very helpful in becoming very clear about what permaculture is and what it isn't. So he says here that permaculture is a philosophy of working with rather than against nature. It's a system of protracted and thoughtful observation rather than protracted and thoughtless action. Of looking at systems in all their functions rather than asking only one yield of them, and of allowing systems to demonstrate their own evolutions. Now, it's also based on a recognition that nature or natural systems, they actually do a job. They perform a function. It's not solely something that is extracted or used to create a product that can then be sold, for some kind of monetary gain. That there is an endemic, there is an inherent nature. There's an inherent value in nature itself. And sometimes we have to kind of step back and maybe think about what it is actually that nature provides us with. What are the jobs, what are the functions that nature provides us with, so we can be very clear about what we are actually in danger of losing. So if some of you, I would think, are probably involved in life sciences, ecology. We might have ecologists in the room. I'm sure some of you are farmers. But one of the first things I'd like to explain or point out is, very explicitly, is what exactly is it that nature or natural systems provide us with. And what you'll see in the academy, in academia, is that we often characterize the services that are provided by nature in 4 basic categories. The first 2 here, provisioning services and regulating services. Right? These are 2 basic categories of functions or jobs that nature provides us with. So we have food, for example, under the provisioning services. food, such as seafood and game. We have crops. We have wild foods, spices. We have water. We have pharmaceuticals, biochemicals, industrial products, and also energy, such as hydropower and biomass fuels. And then we have the regulating services that nature provides. So these are all the biogeochemical cycles, so things like carbon sequestration, climate regulation, the decomposition of waste, the detoxification of hazardous wastes, the purification of air and water, the pollination of crops, the control of pests and disease. Then we also have what are called the supporting services, which would include the dispersal of nutrients and the cycling of nutrient, the dispersal of seeds, and primary production of materials that comes from these systems, and then also the cultural services. And these are the sort of the intangible things that we get from having access to natural systems. So this would include cultural, intellectual, and spiritual inspiration, recreational experiences, and scientific discovery. So these are some of the obvious things that come from having access to functional ecosystems. Now, this forms a type of pool of capital, right? This is a form of wealth. And the way that we've been able to create lives for ourselves, the way that we've been able to create civilizations is through the use of these various forms of capital, again, to produce a certain result. Now, some colleagues of mine have created this particular understanding of how, again, these pools of capital can work, again, beyond just simply thinking about money or monetary forms of capital, but we also have things like intellectual capital, which would include ideas, concepts, knowledge. We have experiential capital, which would be, again, you have this embodied know-how, being able to do things, skills. We have cultural capital, which would include things like stories, myths, songs. We have living capital, which would be things like soil and water, animals, plants. Financial capital, which would include money, currency, financial securities. We have material capital, which would include raw materials, products, structures. We have social capital, which would include influence or connections. And we also have spiritual capital, which would encompass faith, karma, presence. All of these things are varieties of capital that are pieced together, that are utilized, again, to create a life for ourselves. And the goal of permaculture is to provide us a means to be able to utilize all of these things, again, to produce the highest expression of benefit possible. Again, by way of design, by way of very intentional design. Now, permaculture as a system is not only concerned about the technical particulars of what will allow for these elements to be connected. It's informed, permaculture as a design system is informed by a set of ethics and a set of principles. So this is really what separates permaculture design from other systems of design. It's the fact that it explicitly is defined by a set of principles and ethics that direct the design, or the way in which we design. And so I'd like to take a look at some of those principles, if I may. So the first thing I'd like to show here are the permaculture ethics, it's a three-pronged ethic. And again, from these ethics, you have a set of principles that informs the way that we put together all of the pieces that we've just identified. So the first principle is care of the earth, right? Earth care. And this idea is fairly simple and pretty obvious. One of the ways I like to explain this or define this is the idea that I'm safe if the earth is safe. I'm taken care of if the earth is taken care of. I'm in danger if the earth is in danger. And this extends actually to the second ethic. This understanding extends to the second ethic, which is care of people, or care of the people. And again, this one is, again, very obvious, right? I'm safe if you're safe. I'm taken care of if you're taken care of. I'm in danger if you're in danger. And so there's an enlightened self-interest in extending a concern about something outside of yourself, because you realize that your safety, your well-being, is intimately tied to the well-being and safety of everything outside of you. Okay. The third ethic is what we call fair share, or fair share of the surplus. So whatever is produced from, again, the systems that have been constructed, from the design, that the surplus is reinvested back into the system so that it can continue to function. Right? So it's this very well-considered, intelligent use of energy or work capacity, which allows for the system to continue to operate as in perpetuity if possible, as long as possible. So this fair share of the surplus is really determined by you understanding at what point have you taken enough in order to meet your needs, and you don't go beyond that. Again, it's out of a sense of enlightened self-interest. Now, there are a set of principles which are derived from the ethics. The principles come from an observation of the underlying principles by which nature functions. Now, you may ask, why are we looking to nature for principles that guide our lives? Right? Why are we using this as a basis for creating, again, these systems? Well, first of all, because we are part of nature. We are a component, a very important component within the assembly of the natural world. And I think understanding ourselves as being part of the natural world is one of the first misconceptions that has to be corrected or addressed in thinking that we somehow exist outside of the natural world. We are but another expression, right, of the sort of the productive energies or the productive capacities of natural systems. And it's really it's the best example that we've got. It's the best, most successful, long-term example that we have. So I think if we were smart, human beings have fairly large brains, and we sort of like to think of ourselves as being intelligent. We would probably do well to sort of take the hint and perhaps look to nature to see if we can identify strategies or a set of rules or principles or guidelines that we may be able to use as well. So the first principle outlined here, and this is actually a list that was derived from Bill Mollison's principles, and this is sort of a condensed version that was put together by a gentleman named David Holmgren, who's credited as being one of the co-founders of permaculture. So the first principle he identified here is observe and interact. Observe and interact. And again, the value of stopping to observe and to interact with the world you live in is to get as good of an understanding of the setting within which you find yourself operating, so that you can understand how you need to behave, how you need to operate. Because if you misunderstand what's happening, if you don't properly understand the place in which you find yourselves, then everything you do will likely sort of upset the order. So observing and interacting is is really the basis upon which everything else is built. The second principle is to catch and to store energy. Catch and to store energy. Now, what is the importance of energy? I think so we have to be very clear about how energy is defined. Let me ask, how would you define energy? Can someone give me a definition of what energy is? Anybody? Don't be shy. Can you translate? What is energy?
Dicevo, sun radiation.
The sun is a source of energy, but I'm asking, what is energy? What is energy? The basic definition. Movement? Kind of, sort of. I mean, you need energy in order to move. True, but it doesn't tell me what energy is.
Something that is able to make it work.
Exactly. Energy, defined in really any basic physics course, any science course, it is the ability to do work. Energy is having the ability to do something, right? Now, what that something is, that's yet to be determined. But having the ability is what we first need to acquire, right? So catching and storing energy as a design goal is central to permaculture as a design system, because if we're not able to capture and to store energy, it means that we're not able to do any work, do any of the things that we just outlined in the ecosystem services. Again, we have to understand that nature does a job. It actually has a function. And in order to do the job or to function, it needs to be able to capture the energy necessary to produce that outcome. Okay. So catching and storing energy is a centrally important aspect of permaculture. The third point here is to obtain a yield. Obtain a yield. Now, obtaining a yield is simply being able to produce something. The yield is going to be one of two things. Either it's going to be a product, you're creating something materially, or it's going to be a service, right? Again, performing a job. And we just outlined what some of those yields are in nature, right? You have the four services: provisioning services, supporting services, regulating services, cultural services. That is the yield provided by nature. How does nature do that? It captures and stores energy. Okay, what are the energies that nature uses? And you already said one. Sun. So the sun is one. Water is two. Wind, right? Air, right? Sun, water, air, and you get the world, right? You get trees, you get grass, you get fruit, you get vegetables, you have soil, you've got animals, you have us. Right, that's all produced from sun, water, air. You get sun, water, air, you get matter. Right? And it's pretty remarkable that the whole variety of products and services that comes from simply being able to utilize sun, water, air. Right, so that is obtain a yield. 4, apply self-regulation and accept feedback. So the idea of applying self-regulation is, again, just being aware of what's happening with you or any natural element, being aware of what's happening with it. And then based on its ability to understand what's going on with itself, it is able to then formulate a response that makes sense given what's happening. And at some point, again, being able to apply self-regulation also means knowing when to say enough, when to say I don't need any more, knowing when to say enough, I have enough. And then also the willingness to accept feedback, understanding that the things you do will produce a response. And that you have to be open to, again, being able to take on what the response may be and then make adjustments. Number 5, use and value renewable resources and services. So again, this is everything that we just talked about. What are the renewable resources that are outlined here? We just listed them. Being able to use the sun, being able to use water, being able to use the wind, and utilizing those in a way that allows us to be able to produce as many varieties of yields as possible. And that this, again, can continue based on our ability to utilize those resources in the best way possible. Number 6, produce no waste. And I think this is a central feature of the way in which natural systems function, is that there is no waste in nature. Right? The output of one component or one system becomes the input of another. Right? So it's seamless. It's a seamless chain of energy, of work capacity that is used to produce a product while producing no waste. Right? One of the ways in which Bill defines pollution in the book is he defines it as being an underutilized resource. Right? Pollution is an underutilized resource. So I'll give you an example. In most industrial agricultural operations, especially if you are dealing with livestock or animals, there is a huge problem with being able to manage manure. Right? In many cases, you can have such high concentrations of manure that you have very toxic situations arise. So, for example, I live in England at the moment, and I remember a news story that came from the Brittany coast in France, in northern France, about an outbreak of blue-green algae that came from high concentrations of manure produced by an industrial pig production facility. And that this blue-green algae had become so highly concentrated that it started to produce toxic gas. And the toxic gas, poison, which is poison, ended up killing a number of livestock that were in the area, and I think also a couple of people that were in the area where this outgassing had occurred. In some cases, you'll have explosions that will occur because of the high concentrations of methane that come from this very concentrated collection of manure. Now, you have to ask yourself, is the problem the manure in this situation? Is that where you see the problem? Or is the problem the management of the manure? Right? These are two different issues. Right? There's the material and there's the management of the material. And this is where, again, the design aspect comes in. What if you were able to create a design in which the material was used in a way that would avoid the occurrence of the problem in the first place? Right? And so that's a very intentional outcome, because you now have a problem that can then become actually a resource. It can actually become something very valuable if you're able to use it in the best way. Again, and so this is really, again, at the heart of everything that we're talking about here, is being able to look at things from a different perspective, so that instead of seeing problems, you're actually able to see solutions. That the problem actually is the solution. And that this is, interestingly enough, this is one of the central principles of permaculture design. So we go to the next. Principle. Number 7, design from patterns to details. design from patterns to details. One of the central aspects of permaculture design is this idea of patterning. The patterning of design, or pattern language, and that you can understand the way that the world functions, you can understand the various phenomena in the world through being able to decipher or notice, observe patterns. Everything works in patterns. Weather works in patterns. Human behavior works in patterns. History works in patterns. Right? You see, sort of, if you can back up and gain the right perspective on what it is that you're observing from the correct vantage point, then you're able to recognize these patterns. And you don't get so much caught up in the specific, discrete details. Right? You're able to see sort of this symphony that is arranged if you're able to look at all of the parts from the right vantage point, from the right scale. And if you can understand the pattern, or you can understand the underlying driver of the behavior, then you're able to better utilize each of the components that are actually placed into the pattern. So a central aspect of permaculture design is being able to recognize or understand patterns. Right? And nature is one of the greatest exhibitors of this pattern functioning. And that if you can understand the patterns of nature, you will then find that you can become a very powerful and a very effective designer in that regard. Number 8, integrate rather than segregate. So again, as I was explaining before, the relationship of the various systems, the various organs, the various aspects of how the body is put together, again, it is an integrated whole. Right? You don't have the systems in your body operating separate from one another. The reason why it works is because everything is integrated, because it's all together. And so if you can take that operating principle, that functioning principle of integrating components in a very, again, well-considered way, you have a compatible, you understand how to put the right pieces together in the right way. Right? You will be able to see that you're able to you produce interdependent relationships. That was the term I was looking for. Right? You produce interdependent relationships instead of independent relationships. Right? So interdependency is about putting things together that are made better for having been connected to another element. Like you may have elements that might be perfectly fine in being by themselves, but they can be made better if you can put them together with something else that actually raises its performance, right, or its well-being. Number 9, use small and slow solutions. Use small and slow solutions. This is something that you'll see again throughout natural systems, that it's an aggregation, an assembly of lots of small sort of communities or assemblies, smaller assemblies that are put together or aggregated. And one of the benefits of being able to use small and slow solutions is that you avoid fast and enormous failures. And this is one of the things that I think marks a great deal of what we see in industrial infrastructure, industrial systems, is that we often see these very large, expensive, catastrophic failures occur because there's this failure to recognize this underlying aspect of how natural systems work. Number 10, use and value diversity. Now, the diversity that's spoken of here is one related to function, right? Functional diversity. And this is one of the things that you'll see in places that still has some semblance of its sort of biological diversity. And this is one of the dangers of the at this point in history where we're losing biodiversity in many parts of the planet. Now, of course, it's nice seeing, animals and insects and flowers and trees that have different colors and shapes and sizes, and it's all very, it's very beautiful. It's aesthetically, it's really quite stimulating. But what we are in danger of losing when we no longer have access to this diversity is function. So the functions are, again, very much connected to what was just covered before with the ecological services, the ecosystem services. Is that the fewer elements that we have in nature capable of doing the jobs that we need from nature, the more likely we are to, again, run into problems. So we now see this, for example, with climate instability, climate change, land degradation, and then, of course, this has impacts on food security, water security, and then eventually this, of course, goes on to human populations. So you have problems with refugees, internally displaced peoples, conflict over dwindling resources. All of these things are a product of no longer having access to this functional diversity that is very much a part of intact natural systems. Now, this also carries over into human systems, into social systems, that, of course, different cultures, different peoples have ways of being able to look at the world and be in the world that actually makes all of us better if we're able to come into contact with another, because we all have our strengths and weaknesses, right? We all have our talents and deficiencies. And by being able to integrate and value diversity, then we are able to actually see how you have this whole other set of possibilities that comes from this willingness to seek out a way of being able to create these interdependencies. Number 11, use edges and value the marginal. Now, one of the things that we see in natural systems is that some of the most productive portions of ecosystems are the edges that you will find between two different biomes. That you will often find the highest number of productive possibilities and the highest functioning at the interface between two different systems. So, for example, between the forest and the sea, right? Or between, say, a pasture and a woodland. And you will find very large, expansive diversity and, in terms of ecologically speaking, you have very, very efficient use of, effective use of sunlight and water. You have all of these things that they exist at the edges. So one of the primary goals of the design work that we do is we actually are seeking to create edges so that we can produce this outcome. So this is something that, again, it just comes from an observation of how natural systems function. And number 12, creatively use and respond to change. Creatively use and respond to change. If there's anything that can be said about the world that we live in and about nature, is that everything changes all of the time. Everything changes all of the time. So having a willingness to be able to, again, operate in a manner that's consistent with the world that you live in is again, a central aspect of what makes designing in this manner successful, is that it's willing to acknowledge the reality of this fact. So, and this is arguably the greatest Achilles heel to looking at the world through an industrial lens, is that industrialization, in many ways, industrial infrastructure, seeks to try to keep everything the same, right? So let's compare, say, a building, right? The infrastructure that's created by a static building to that is created by a forest or a jungle or pasture or a mangrove, right? It has this ability to be able to adjust to the incoming energies, and sort of expresses the fact that these energies change. And the moment that the seed is put into the ground, these systems actually get better over time. Right? The moment you have these living systems, again, birthed and brought into the world, they actually get better and stronger and better over time. The moment you build, say, some type of static infrastructure, again, like a building or a car or what have you, the moment it's built and the moment you start using it, all of your time and your energy is spent trying to keep it from falling apart. And this is, again, one of the things that marks in principle and in function, from a practical standpoint, this is what separates, again, natural systems from sort of man-made infrastructure that seeks to sort of hold time in place. And it's simply not possible. It doesn't recognize the fact that we are living in a world that changes all of the time. Now, if one of the other lists of principles I'd like to take a look at is actually one that comes from Bill, and you'll actually find this in the designer's manual, funnily enough. Now, he has a set of 15 principles, and some of them are going to be repeats of what we just covered. So just to go through these quickly, here the first principle outlined, enough is the key principle of wise resource use. The second, work with nature, not against it, which we had just said. The third, the problem is the solution, or see solutions, not problems. Right? And I think one of the really important things here is a great deal of what we're talking about is just simply being willing to change one's perspective. A lot of this has to do with changing one's attitude. Right? The problem is the solution, or see solutions, not problems. Number 4, make the least change for the greatest possible effect. Make the least change for the greatest possible effect. Number 5, the yield of a system is theoretically unlimited. Again, meaning that the things that may be produced from a system is theoretically unlimited. And we're not only just talking about materially what can be produced from the system. It has, again, there are a variety of different outcomes that may be produced. What do you think the limitation on the system is? To an extent. What's the real limitation? What is the real limitation to the system? Imagination. So that means that the limitation is what? You are the limitation. And it's very important to understand. And I think this points to a tendency that we often have to where when we begin to identify problems, we often sort of externalize the source of the problem, and somehow the problem is out there. No, the problem's in here. Right? It's you not being able to see something that may in fact be possible and attainable, but because of where you find yourself observing things or the way that you're thinking about things, you are blind to the possibility. Right? So again, a great deal of what we're discussing here has a lot to do with the way that one thinks. Right? So the problem's not out there. The problem's in here. Everything gardens. Everything gardens, meaning everything has a job. Everything has a function. It exists for a reason. Your job is to figure out what that purpose is. And I often make sports analogies. And really what you are as a designer in many ways is just, you're trying to become a good coach. Right? And the job of a coach, or you guys say manager here, right? Like when you talk about football, you're trying to be a good manager. I keep on forgetting. And the job of the coach or the manager is to put their players in the best position to utilize whatever talents they have. And really that's all you're trying to do as a designer is you look at all your players, you look at all of your components that you want to assemble, and you're trying to put it in the best position to do whatever it does well, you want it to put it in a place so it can do that thing well, right? So it can fully express its talents and its abilities. So in the point about how everything gardens, everything from the small microbe, right, the bacteria, the nematode, the protozoa, the woodlouse, the ant, the worm, right, the hedgehog, the snake, you know, even the locust or the spider, all the way up to, the hawk or the falcon, or again, obviously the horse or the cow or the wolf or the fox. Everything has a job. It's like a piece to the puzzle. Your job is to create a place for them to express themselves, whatever it is that they have to express in the best manner possible. Right? There's a sort of a well-known farmer in America named Joel Salatin, and he talks about sort of creating an environment to where, say, a chicken is capable of fully expressing its chickenness. Right? So in many ways, that's what you were seeking to do as designers, is you're trying to create a habitat or a niche for as many different things to express themselves, or whatever their sort of existential purpose is, to the highest degree. Number 7, everything works both ways. Everything works both ways, meaning it could either be a harm or a benefit, right? It could be something good or something bad. So one of the examples I'll use is, tools are a great example of this principle. When Jeff's going to come in to speak this afternoon, one of his favorite topics is earthworks, right? Earthworking machines, things like bulldozers and excavators and large machines that were originally, when they were created, they were used to knock down forests, basically. Many of these machines were used to clear land, right? And many people obviously are going to look at these machines and see them as being problems, right? They're going to see them as being inherently bad. But the way that he uses them, and other people that sort of do similar work, is he uses a machine that was originally intended for destructive use, and he actually uses it to repair land rather than destroy it, right? Now the difference between using a tool that was created to destroy things and then taking that and trying to use it as a tool to repair or improve land is one's intention. What do you intend to do when you pick up a tool and you want to go use it, right? So for example, a screwdriver. A screwdriver was made to put in screws. Well, somebody else might see the screwdriver and they see it as a weapon, right? The screwdriver itself is neutral. The thing that's not neutral is, again, the user who picks up the tool to use it, right? So this idea that everything works both ways is, I think, something that's very important, because this really affects the way in which we understand the world. Designed to accelerate succession and evolution. Designed to accelerate succession and evolution. So this principle has to do with understanding that, again, nature sort of operates in a particular manner over a period of time. Like if you look at the ecological succession of, say, of a typical landscape. So let's take a look at this. Where are we? So this is actually a figure that was put together by a colleague of mine named Dan Halsey, and this is supposed to depict the development of a landscape that is in the process of being repaired. And on the x-axis here on the bottom, it's providing a timeline of the different stages of development for this landscape as it's being repaired. Now you go from putting in the basis for the restoration work to occur, and then each of the different elements that make up a landscape having the ability to establish itself. So anything from grasses and perennial plants and forbs and say shrubs, small trees, medium-sized trees, eventually climax species of trees, and then obviously all of the different life forms that accompany each of those things. And here you can see as it, over time, that as the sort of the basis for all of those things to be able to, you know, be present in that landscape, as the conditions are provided for those things to actually exist, right? You'll see that the succession of all of the various parts of that landscape, right, is able to occur more quickly. So one of the things that you'll see here is, as over time, the color of the figure gets darker, and this is supposed to indicate that you have more of a soil building capacity, the more that you have these ecological elements present in this landscape. So one of the things that you'll notice if you look at the history of civilizational collapse, for instance, there are three main reasons as to why civilizations have collapsed historically. And again, it's very much sort of reflected in the figure here. If we look at, say, these two books, for instance, and there are a number of books that talk about this phenomenon. This book in particular is one that I often point to. It's a book written by an author named Jared Diamond. He's a professor at UCLA, the University of California, Los Angeles. And the name of the book is called Collapse: How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed. I think it's a very interesting subtitle, How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed. And he's identified a number of common modes of failure. I want to be able to show you those. Hold on. Where are we? Here we go. Actually, this is a better figure here. There we go. All right, so there's Jared. He's a very kind-looking man, very smart-looking man, huh? So these are the modes of failure that he's identified historically. Right, so the 8 here are deforestation and habitat destruction, soil problems, which would include soil erosion, salinization, and soil fertility losses. And the third are water management problems. Right, so those are the top 3 modes of failure historically for civilizational collapse. And then these are, again, the rest, which are really going to be intimately connected to the top 3 here. So we have overhunting, overfishing. He's identified here the effects of introduced species on native species. This is probably going to be a source of debate for a lot of people. Number 7 is overpopulation, and number 8 is increased per capita impact of people. Again, but this is all connected to these first 3, right? Deforestation and habitat destruction, soil problems, and water management problems. Now, what's interesting about this is presented as 3 different modes of failure, but these are actually sort of the same problem. Do you see that? They're the same problem. Or I should say that each of these problems is sort of the logical, it's a logical progression, right? So the moment you lose your forests and the moment you lose the vegetation in the landscape, you're going to have soil problems. Why? Right, and not only do the plants hold everything together, the plants are the things that make the soil, right? The plants, the vegetation, and all of the life forms that find, that call those places home, they actually create the soil, right? So the moment that you deforest an area and the moment that you remove the vegetation, you're going to have soil problems. And then the moment you have soil problems, you're going to have water problems. Why? Okay, so evaporation is one driver of water loss, but there's something else. Like, so what happens when it rains? What happens to the water when it rains? When it hits the ground? It's supposed to get into the ground, right? Ideally, the water would be able to get in the ground, right? And then as the water goes in the ground, right, you have storages under the ground. Now, what happens when you lose the forest and you lose the vegetation, right? And you're exposed to the sun and the wind, right? The ground gets hard, okay? Then it rains. The ground's too hard for the water to get into the ground, so what happens? It goes over the ground. And then the longer it's on top of the ground, exposed to the sun and the wind, right, evaporates, it's gone. So then, and if that happens over a long enough period of time, that area where you have these problems dominate, that area is basically no longer working properly. People can't live in that area anymore, and you have to go somewhere else. Right? And as I said, this is actually the way in which this is the primary driver, right, behind human history being progressive, geographically speaking, why people have had to move from place to place. Now, again, the interesting thing is the primary reason or the primary driver of that process is agriculture. Right? The primary driver of that process is agriculture. So just to go back to the previous figure, if I may. So I said I left off here. Actually, no. Left off here. So, again, over time, if you have all of the sort of ecological components in place, you will find that the ability for the landscape to build soil, to be productively functional, to provide, again, all of the services that ideally a landscape would be able to provide, right? You'll find that this succession will occur more quickly because all of the elements are in place for it to do so. And this is something that can actually be designed, right? This rapid or accelerated succession can be designed if you understand the processes by which nature actually accomplishes this task, until eventually you're able to fully have all of these ecological functions and this full ecological infrastructure in place. So you'll have hydrological cycle is functioning properly, the ability to build soil, the ability to produce food, the ability to, again, cycle nutrients, all of the various functions that we would ideally have available to us. by way of a functioning landscape, intact landscape is provided. And I think the significance of pointing this out is the fact that this is something that is a designed outcome. It's a designed outcome. It's not an accident. It's something that has been very clearly, intentionally constructed. Right? And there is a method, and there are a set of guidelines that allow for us to be able to meet with that outcome. Okay. So back to Bill's list. So that was, designed to accelerate succession and evolution. Use relative location. Use relative location. The idea that depending on how you place certain elements in relation to one another, that this will, again, produce a certain set of outcomes. So, for example, how you place a house in relation to the sun and the wind, or how you place it in relation to, say, a row of trees, how you position one species of crop in relation to another, whether or not the crops that you have put together or the species you've assembled, whether or not they're compatible, or whether or not they're antagonist. You know, one species will prevent another species from being able to grow properly. A very classic example would be, say, putting an apple tree next to a walnut tree. Right, so apples and walnuts don't do very well together. Actually, walnuts don't do very well with much of anything. But understanding the relationship that exists between certain species, this would allow for you to be able to place them in the best position possible if you are able to utilize this relative principle, this relative positioning or relative location principle. Each important function is supported by many elements. Each important function is supported by many elements, meaning the way that we often think about how these designs work, the way that these designed assemblies work, is we're thinking about function first, and then we try to identify a number of components that fulfill that function or do that job. Now, the goal is to assemble a design to where you are never without a critically important function being performed. So in that sense, we're not designing for efficiency. Right? What we're actually designing for is what we would call functional redundancy. Right? So you assemble as many elements as possible to make sure that that critical function is always being performed. And in many ways, that is, again, how the body is assembled. Like, so for example, you don't have one eye, you have two. Right? You don't have one nostril, you have two. You don't have one ear, you have two. You don't have one lung, you have two. Right? You don't have one leg, you have two. You don't have one or two toes, you have 10. Right? You have, so you can live with one lung. You can get by with one eye. Or you could probably get by with a couple of teeth. You could probably get by with 2 fingers on each hand, but you have 5. Right? Someone once joked that if an economist designed the body, you would only have one eye, and one nostril, and one lung, and one kidney, and probably one leg, and you'd be hopping around like this. Right? But again, the point isn't efficiency. The point is you want to be effective in whatever the function is that you need done. So you have as many parts as is necessary in order for, again, the function to be effectively performed. And really that's the way that we're attempting to design. Okay, next. Each element or component performs many functions. Right, so we have, just to highlight that again, each important function is supported by many elements, and each element performs many functions. right? So each of the elements that we are assembling within a design, they perform more than one job. So again, you have this functional overlap. And the idea behind that, again, is you are never without a critically important function from being available to you. Again, that's a designed outcome. Or another way of expressing this is use everything to its highest capacity. Right? Use everything to its highest capacity. And then some other principles that Bill specifically outlines, he mentions the importance of bringing food production back to the cities, right? Bringing food production back to areas where you have concentrated populations of people. Because one of the big problems that we now have with the way that most of the essentials, again, that we rely on for our lives, is that they are sort of produced in a place that's remote from the places from where we live. So if you were to do sort of an energy analysis currently on what it takes to provide 1 calorie of food in the industrial world, kind of first world, it takes about 20 calories of energy to produce 1 calorie of food. Right, so that would include everything from the actual cultivation or production of the crop, to the harvesting, to the processing, to the packaging, all of the logistical systems that are involved in the transport and the supply. Right, and then we haven't even, and I think that figure does not include the amount of energy that is spent in dealing with the waste. So that's actually quite a conservative figure, that 20 calories of energy to produce 1 calorie of food. Okay, so this is one of the reasons why there is a need to concentrate on sort of localizing production systems in relation to cities or places where you have large populations of people. Help make people self-reliant is another principle. Help make people self-reliant. Next one, increase diversity, and so increase stability. So this was another aspect of the diversity principle that was mentioned in the previous list that it's very important to highlight, is that when you have sort of the functional diversity that exists within a system, you see this in nature, that there is a stability and a resilience that you find in those systems. Again, why is that? Because all of the jobs necessary in order to establish stability are provided by having this functional diversity. Right, so this is why we want to include this principle, again, as a very intentionally identified and emphasized point within the design work that we're seeking to accomplish. And lastly, cooperation, not competition. Cooperation, not competition. And again, this is something that you'll see exhibited by natural systems. Even in instances that appear to be competitive and adversarial. I'll give you one example of this. There's again, a great experiment that was done in the US that involved the reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone National Park in this must be California. Well, Yellowstone's actually quite large. It covers a number of places. But Yellowstone reintroduced wolves into the park. And what they found was that reintroducing the wolves completely changed the ecological dynamics of the park, because the introduction of the wolves changed the movement of all of the animals. And most notably, it changed the movement of the game animals. So things like elk and deer and moose, all of the animals that would typically graze from the various areas in the park. And one of the problems that occurs when you no longer have, say, apex predators in an ecosystem is that you'll often have those grazing animals sort of eat too much, and it doesn't give the land an opportunity to regenerate itself. What reintroducing the wolf did was it changed the behavior of the animals, which then allowed for the vegetation to come back. So as the vegetation came back and the soils became more open, it actually changed the behavior of the rivers. It changed the behavior of the water. And then once the water changed, they said they actually started to see beavers come back. And the way that the beavers ended up managing the waterways, again, allowed for this whole other set of outcomes to be produced simply by reintroducing one element. And it happened to be the right element. And I think it's actually a great example of the principle of make the least change for the greatest effect. Right? So being able to understand sort of where the pressure points are, where the pivot points happen to be within the confines of these assemblies is something that's really important to take notice of, because this is again a very intentionally produced outcome, right? By understanding how rearranging or introducing the right element at the right time at the right place can then end up producing a number of beneficial responses. Okay, so again, one could look at the relationship between the wolf and the game animal, the wolf, the predator, and the prey as being an adversarial one or a competitive one. But if you sort of expand one's perspective and scope and see actually what's happening, the real winner in that in that reintroduction of the wolf is the land. So in many cases, so really what you can say is that the wolf, which is often seen as a villain, is actually a hero in relation to what it did for the health of the landscapes. So in a way, sort of predators are like the guardians of landscapes. Right? They keep them alive because it governs the traffic and the behavior of everything else. Right? And the only way that you're able to, again, come to that understanding is being able to look at it from the right perspective. Look at the dynamics and the relationship of all of the pieces together from the right perspective. Okay. Now, one of the last things I want to mention, and I think maybe, Ignacio, I'm sorry. Can we maybe have a dialogue or a back and forth, a Q&A after I mention this last point? I think the last one of the last points I'd like to mention here is another quote from Bill. And here I think he makes a very powerful point here. And I think it's a very powerful commentary about sort of the nature of what human beings, what people have been made into, sort of in the modern world, and how we've sort of our role in it has been imagined here. He says, the greatest change we need to make is from consumption to production, meaning that people need to think of themselves as being producers rather than simply being consumers. The greatest change we need to make is from consumption to production, even if on a small scale. In our own gardens, if only 10% of us do this, there is enough for everyone. Hence the futility of revolutionaries who have no gardens, who depend on the very system they attack, and who produce words and bullets, not food and shelter. Right? Who produce words and bullets, not food and shelter. Now this goes back to the point I was making before about what are the ethics that govern permaculture design as a concept, really as a practical reality. Right? Care for the earth, care for people, fair share of the surplus. right? Really, this is really about creating the opportunity for people, just like Joel Salatin was saying on the farm. He wants to create a situation or an environment to where chickens can fully express their chickenness. Well, in many ways, the goal of permaculture, as a practical matter, is to create a situation where people have an opportunity to fully express their humanity, right? To fully realize what it is that they have to offer in being human beings, right? So, with that, and there are a number of the things I'd like to mention, but I don't want to, use all of this time speaking at you or talking to you. I'd like to have this be an exchange, and hopefully in the course of having an exchange, there's some other points that that can be mentioned. So, can we do that? So, does anyone have a question, comment? Anyone have sort of inspiration, a critique? Please.
Il mio problema è un problema sul tempo. Viviamo in una società che si sta degradando in tempi molto veloci e i tempi della permacultura sono tempi molto lenti. È vero che ci sono delle cose che danno magari frutto in 10 anni, ma 10 anni passano e se il seme non si pianta all'inizio, dopo 10 anni non hai niente. Questo secondo me è un concetto abbastanza importante, no? Cioè bisogna iniziare subito un cambiamento e questo cambiamento però, come dire, ha questa necessità di inversione di rotta veloce e nello stesso tempo sappiamo che avverrà in tempi lunghi, per cui appunto è un invito a cominciare presto.
Grazie mille. Thank you for that. I would agree. I agree with everything that you said, or everything that I caught while it once I was able to get this on. But I think the point about that these systems be take an extended period of time, happen slowly, and I think this is maybe I could better explain the principle of use small, slow solutions. The small and slow solutions don't necessarily mean that the way that we're able to remediate many of the problems that we're seeing occurring in the world has to be slow. So, for example, actually, let's take a look at this picture. This is actually a before and after picture of a project from China called the Loess Plateau Watershed Rehabilitation Project, which some of you may have heard of before. So the Loess Plateau is an area in China that had been heavily degraded over the course of China's history. It's actually seen as being the cradle of Chinese civilization. So roughly, you're looking at 6,000 years of history. And over that time, the Loess Plateau had become heavily degraded and really blighted by many of the same problems that I just mentioned earlier. So drought, floods, famine, again, displaced peoples, high rates of poverty. And there was a program that was proposed to remediate that area. So it covered the 4 poorest regions in China. And in total, I think the area it covered was 35,000 square kilometers. It's about 3.5 million hectares. It's about the size of the Netherlands or Belgium, something in that area. So within 10 years, they had a budget of about $500 million, $500 million. Within 10 years, they were able to remediate this area. They were able to triple the incomes of the farmers in in this region, tripled 3 times, and they cut the rate of poverty from just under 60% to 27% in 10 years. Now, the way that they did that was they invested specifically in the remediation of the degraded landscapes, because those landscapes were the basis for roughly, 2.5 million, 3 million people to make a living. So here you can see some of the work that was done. So there was extensive terracing that was put into place. And again, the specific actions or steps that were taken in creating this outcome were, again, it was something that was designed. There were very specific measures that were taken, there's very specific priorities that were put into place. They were ordered, and in doing so, they were able to, again, get this outcome. Now, there are a number of films that document the development of the project. There's one called Lessons from the Los Plateau, or Lessons of the Los Plateau. The other one is called Hope in a Changing Climate. Right, and you can see these films on YouTube, and the principles that they used to do this remediation work basically are the same principles that we just discussed that are highlighted in permaculture design. Now, the fact that they were able to do that in 10 years, I think, is a testament to the fact that we can remediate large-scale natural ecosystems. That it is technically possible to do that. It is physically possible to do that. We know how to do it, right? It's been done. It's just a matter of pointing, again, the resources in the right direction that will allow for, number one, the people to be sort of produced or trained that are capable of providing the work input for this job to be done. So this is obviously something that has to go beyond simply, you know, a small group of individuals, you know, going out and doing the work themselves. I mean, what's great about this is this was something that was sanctioned by government, that was supported by government and other international organizations. I think the financing for this actually came from, funnily enough, the World Bank Rural Development Agency, and they got it very right. You know, it was very well organized, very well planned, very well designed, and I think the great thing about this example is, again, it shows us that it's possible. It's possible to do. It's just, is there a willingness on the part of, you know, decision makers, politicians, policy people, you know, those folks who are responsible for opening the door to gaining access to the resources that allows for the job to be done, and are, you know, local leaders, national leaders, regional leaders, will they actually get behind this effort and mobilize the things that are necessary in order for the work to be accomplished? And that's really what it comes down to, because we can do it, it's possible, and we can do it relatively quickly. I think here's the other stunning thing about this project. Now look at what it cost. Okay, so so again, $500 million. That's over 10 years. Used to remediate approximately 3.5 million hectares. If you break down that cost over 10 years, it's approximately $142.86 per hectare. That's over 10 years. So that means the investment per year was $14.29 per hectare per year over 10 years, and you got that result. So I think the thing that, you know, the thing that occurs to me is that this is embarrassingly cheap. Like in the grand scheme of things, this is embarrassingly cheap. And I think for a fraction, actually a fairly small fraction of the annual defense budget in the United States, we could remediate all of the degraded areas of the earth. For a fraction of 1 year, for a fraction of the defense budget in the U.S., for 1 year, we could fix all of the degraded areas of the globe. It's just a matter of, do people want to do it? And that's really the question, is, do people want to do it? That's it.
When is it starting?
When is this? No, they've already done it. Oh, it started in, it started in 1995, and it went to 2005. Went from 1995 to 2005. That's when that program ran. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Rhamis. I was just wondering if you could talk about the role of succession in this and obtaining multiple harvests and ways that we can do that also in the Mediterranean.
You said
the role of succession in a project like this. So how we're able to maybe get a diversity of products over time with different plant compositions.
Yeah. So for example, if we look at actually, let's look at a few of the sort of technical particulars here. Now, one of the main features of permaculture systems is the use of sort of a mixed use of land in terms of production. So I'll show you. So let's take a look at this. This is an example of one of the central design features that's used in permaculture design. It's something that's called a food forest. In some circles, it would be called a polyculture. This would be a good example of something that would be advocated for in sort of agroecological or agricultural ecologies, is that you're actually creating an ecology. And I think this is one of the ways that we could define agriculture in an ecological sense, is that agriculture is just really bad ecology. Like, it's awful ecology. And as a design goal is we would like to actually create ecologies that have a very specific purpose, in this case, that have an eye on production, but also provides all of the ecological services and functions that would ideally be in an intact ecological assembly. Now, what's been done in the creation of the food forest or the edible garden model is that we've tried to identify all of the different components, the patterns that you would find in an intact ecology, right? So this is an example of looking at nature from the patterning standpoint. So all ecological assemblies have some combination of these elements. So we got everything from the canopy, right, the tall tree or the climax species, to the subcanopy, which could be a large shrub or a medium-sized tree, to 3, which would be a shrub or maybe a dwarf tree, to 4, which would be the herbaceous layer, which would be something like a forb, like comfrey or dock leaf or something of that nature. Number 5, you have the ground cover or the creeper. Then you have number 6, which would be an underground layer, maybe a tuber or a root crop. And then number 7 is the sort of a vertical layer, which would be like a climber or a creeper. Now, the point behind that was made before about accelerating ecological succession is that this assembly, when you put them together properly, and you identify the right species at each of the layers, is that because of the way that the life cycle at each layer runs, right, some of them are very fast. So for example, the ground covers are relatively fast life cycles. And then so the layers that cycle through very quickly then feed the next layer above it, which actually runs a little slower. But because it's sort of inputting its energy and its material into fueling or feeding the next layer above it, that layer actually goes faster because it has, again, the input of energy that allows for it to be able to cycle through much more vigorously. And then in turn, that layer feeds the layer above it, and then so on and so forth. So this is really an explanation of the mechanics behind accelerating ecological succession. Every climate, every landscape, sort of every biome has a version of this pattern. It doesn't matter if you're in the arid or the semi-arid, or if you're in the Mediterranean, or if you're in the temperate, right? Or again, if you're in a mangrove, if you're in the tropics, if you're in the subtropics, every biome, every part of the world has a version of this. Right? It's just that the pieces and the specific species are different, but the assembly is basically the same. The pattern of the assembly is the same. Now what can be done, again, to accelerate the succession and then to create the possibility of being able to have productive output that, again, provides, say, good income for a farmer, is just having a very clear understanding as to what are the best species that would allow for you to have the functioning, but also will give you a good economic return. So that would necessitate, for instance, knowing your market. So you producing something that you know you're going to be able to sell for a good price. Also knowing at what scale that you would need to be able, at what scale you should be creating these systems for. Now here's an interesting point from that standpoint. Now if you look at some of the examples that are provided for comparing different size farms, right? Different size farms when you look at output per unit area. So this is a table that came from taken from the United States Agricultural Census from about 25 years ago. And in the first column, you see here the farm size in acres. The second column is the average gross output, that's in dollars per acre. And then the third one is the average net output, in dollars per acre, meaning the output after you figure in costs. Now what you'll notice is that the small farm has much higher output per unit area than the large farm. It's clearly per unit area, it's a much better arrangement because the management can be done much more effectively. You can have much more close management of the smaller area. So you actually get much better output. So I'll give you a good example. This is a story about a farm in an area of California, a town called Sebastopol, which is in Marin County. It's just north of San Francisco. And this farmer, the name of the farm is Singing Frog Farms. And this farm is producing from 1 acre, I believe, 1 acre, which is what? An acre is 1,500, it's about 1,500 square meters, I believe. They're producing $100,000 per acre, right? And the farm is only 8 acres. He's literally producing something like, 10 times the average output, he's producing 10 times the output that an average farmer in California is producing. And it has everything to do with the fact that he's producing on a, again, smaller size, mixed output, and he has a market that's willing to buy what he's producing. That's another important part of this, is actually having people that are willing to buy what's being produced. Here's another example. This is a farmer, an example of a farmer in Canada. And I think it's important that the Canadian example is important because the growing year is quite small, maybe 115 days, 120 days, if that. From 1.5 acres, they're producing $140,000. Right. Here's another example of a small land holding, small farm, high output. Well, that's not what I'm looking for. That's not what I was looking for at all. This is another example. Urban homestead. So this is a family that is producing on 1/10 of an acre, 1/10, which is, yeah, I want to say they're probably, I think they're doing maybe 400 square meters, if even that. I think it's 400 square meters, yeah. They're producing 6,000 pounds, 3 tons of produce from 400 square meters, from the work of 4 people. They are able to fulfill all of their needs as far as their fruit and their vegetables, and then they sell the surplus, which provides them with an additional $20,000, again, from 1/10 of an acre. If you scale that up, you know, to an acre, it's $200,000, right? And if you scale that up to a hectare, right, multiply that by roughly 2.5. So, again, but this is a product of, again, mixed use. Again, you have sort of a variety of different outputs. Some are short term, some are medium term, some are long term, from relatively small areas that are very well managed. And they are managed using sort of ecological principles. Like this is without chemicals, without any of those things. And again, I think, and the reason why they're able to do that is because they have an area that is manageable, right? Where the work input is very, very intelligently and very effectively put to use. Does that answer? Okay. Ciao,
sono un agricoltore e quindi queste considerazioni, come devo dire, mi sembrano, spero di non essere offensivo, abbastanza fuori contesto, cioè non riesco a immaginare, vorrei approfondire come fanno su questa piccola estensione a ottenere così tanti risultati. C'è qualcosa che mi sfugge nei particolari, oppure bisognerà approfondire, dovrò fare un viaggio in Canada, non so. Però oltre a questo, come quasi tutte le cose che fa l'uomo, la difficoltà è iniziare, forse tranne la procreazione. Il resto, la difficoltà è iniziare. Quindi io che facciamo un esempio, ho un'azienda di pochi ettari, per politica sconsiderata me l'hanno fatta diventare desertica, io ho aderito ad alcuni programmi e me l'hanno fatta diversificare. Adesso il mio unico reddito era quello, da dove comincio? Perché non posso aspettare 10 anni, oppure devo attendere che l'intervento pubblico faccia qualche cosa che mi risolva il problema. Mi fermo qui, grazie.
Grazie mille. You know, this Well, there are a variety of factors. I mean, I think, well, for one of the first, and I think you just mentioned it, one of the first things that's going to determine sort of the set of possibilities that exist for you is policy. Whether or not policy provides you with the opportunity to even think about doing certain things. So everything from the way that, whatever the local municipality will permit you to do on your land, as far as what you can produce, how you can produce it, right? How all of these things might be brought in if sort of the rules or the laws allow you to. That's probably first and foremost, because that's probably one of the things that you'll hear a lot of people that make their living, farming or from the land will often mention, is that there's only but so much I can do. So, for example, one of the big problems, say in the United States, for instance, why there are many people who don't adopt many of these approaches is because policy prevents them from doing so. So, for example, if you're a farmer who receives subsidies, for instance, from the government, your ability to receive the subsidy necessitates that you do certain things. And they're often a lot of the wrong thing, right? So we don't have enough of incentive that's given to farmers to actually do sort of the right thing. That's beginning to change somewhat now, but in many cases, policy is often the biggest obstacle that has to be overcome, so that we can even begin considering doing some of these things. But some of it is a lot of it is also just not being aware of some of the options that may be available, either in the way of the types of systems that can be created that will produce this kind of outcome. Some of it may be the way that labor is utilized in relation to how land is laid out. So this can be anything from whether or not you're talking about human labor or mechanized labor, machines, whether or not we have the right tools put into place. It also it has to do with whether or not you have access to markets. If you have actually places that you can sell the things that you're producing for a good price, right, which will allow for you to be able to continue to actually have a viable business. And we just came from Jordan, in the Middle East, and they have a variety of challenges, everything from having enough water to their water quality, to the cost of labor, and one of the things we kept on hearing about was access to markets, because Jordan is in the middle of this region where there's conflict all around them. So the places that Jordanian farmers used to be able to sell their produce to, they've been at war for the last 15 years. So a lot of Jordanian produce used to go to Iraq, or it used to go to Syria, or there's an even larger market they could sell to, say, in Saudi Arabia or in the United Arab Emirates. But because of certain rules or regulations, they don't have access to those markets to the degree that would allow for them to be able to make more money than what they're making now. Obviously, there's certain things that could be done to improve the way that they go about producing food and the way they go about managing their land. And they're beginning to be more open to suggestions because they realize they have very serious issues that if they don't get those handled in relatively short order, that they too may be in danger of falling victim to the same things that have caused the countries around them to basically go to war. And there's an interest in maintaining the stability of that particular country, and it has a lot to do with their ability to produce food and to manage whatever resources they have available to them in the best manner possible. But But a big problem is just simply, again, knowing what kind of options you have available to you in terms of, what are the systems of land management, what are the systems of resource management, planting systems, animal systems, water management systems, that will produce a result, again, that could net you some of these returns. And I think that's why I think, what we're talking about here in terms of what permaculture has to offer, or what other systems that would be characterized as being regenerative design systems, what those things have to offer is so important, because it just opens, I think, a whole set of other possibilities and options to those who might be interested in putting them to use. But you don't have to move to Canada. You can stay here. Actually, you actually have some very, I think there are many things about Italy that are very attractive. I think one of the things, and I talk about this all the time, ever since I met Ignazio, is I always talk about the agricultural heritage of Italy. And one of the things I often talk about is, are a lot of the innovations that have been developed in Italy in terms of, a lot of the agricultural tools, machines, the ways that you're able to utilize these tools in, cultivating land. That it's a real strength, to the region. And I think it's something that's, to be celebrated for. Again, it's just a matter of how do we best make use of the tools? How do we best make use of the work capacity so that we can produce the best result possible? Really, that's a great deal of what we're talking about here.
Benvenuto in Italia, a Bari, è felicissimo di rivederti nella mia terra. Volevo un attimo confrontarmi con te a proposito uno degli ultimi principi citati da Bill Mollison, che ci hai fatto vedere in quella scaletta di principi, appunto. E questo è il principio in cui si menziona la cooperazione, due parole, la cooperazione e la competizione. Per quanto concerne la competizione, ho letto che si esclude la competizione. Volevo sapere da te, siccome la competizione è un processo dell'evoluzionismo darwiniano che ha portato quindi all'evoluzione delle specie, e quindi i principi prendono spunto anche dall'ecologia. Volevo sapere se questa enunciazione, senza esprimere giudizi o avere pregiudizi, cercavo un confronto, se questa enunciazione di questo principio in cui si esclude la competizione è corretta dal tuo punto di vista, oppure si potrebbe rivedere con più cooperazione, meno competizione? Perché la competizione, faccio un esempio empirico, sono stato in natura, ho visto che c'è competizione ad esempio tra una farfalla che si posa su un fiore, arriva un'altra farfalla, la farfalla si alza dal fiore per scacciarla dal suo areale. O ad esempio parlavi dei lupi, i lupi quando arrivano altri lupi nel proprio territorio competono affinché questi nuovi arrivati non entrino nel territorio, salvo che questi nuovi arrivati, queste specie arrivate nuove, si sottomettano, oppure nel caso in cui non si sottomettano, questi addirittura vengono uccisi. Nel caso più eclatante.
Grazie mille. And it's really good to see you, by the way. Yeah, I think the point, and further explaining the point about cooperation versus competition. Again, I think as designers, if we have an opportunity to create relationships in which cooperation predominates rather than competition, then again, this is an ideal. Now that's not to say that, you know, we'd be able to eliminate competition entirely. I mean, competition is sort of it's a reality of, you know, of the world that we live in. And I think one of the dangers, it's funny because I was just reading a paper about this. It was an essay written by a guy named Richard Heinberg called Human Predators, Human Prey, Society as Ecosystem in a Time of Collapse. That's the name of the essay. It's really good, by the way. And he was trying to explain sort of social phenomena, human relationships, by making a direct analogy with natural systems. To his credit, he had, in the beginning of the essay, he had explained that he had said that there are a number of caveats that have to be explained, meaning that this analogizing human society to what we see in nature is, you can run into trouble. I mean, this is exactly what, say, social Darwinists had done in explaining why some people should be able to exploit others. And I think one of the critical differences between the way human beings behave and the way that animals behave is that we don't understand animals to be moral agents. We don't see animals as being moral agents, right? Human beings are moral agents. We're not, so in that sense, we are not like animals. People should be able to distinguish between right and wrong, right? We are, and this is the way I believe, right? So this isn't necessarily something this isn't from Bill, although he does mention this, talking about the importance of ethics. Ethics come out of having moral sensibility. It comes out of the recognition that there is right and wrong, right? So I'll give you a clear example. So I am, and it depends on what era you want to refer to, sort of how I would be defined within the confine of American society or demographics. I am what is called an African American, quote unquote African American. Some people would use the term Black American. I actually think Black American is more accurate because it is a product of what has come to define the formation of America. It is a product of the formation of America, and the description was created for a very specific purpose. Right? It's not an accident. And the reason why the description was created was because it allowed for the ordering of American society in a very specific way. Right? So I am a product of the designation of this particular group of people being used as unpaid labor for the better part of 3 centuries, right, in America, which then sort of, created a situation by which this group of people had sort of history in that country impact them in a particular way. And then it produced a number of different outcomes. And again, it comes out of this principle of like sort of competition, to where the people who created that place found it necessary in their minds to create a system in which they had to take people who didn't necessarily look like them, but they took people that were then made into non-people because they didn't look like them, and then they did certain things to them, right? They defined them in a particular manner to justify, right, exploiting them. And then that produced, a certain amount of wealth for one group of people and an enormous amount of poverty for another group of people, right? Out of this sort of, again, competitive principle. Whereas maybe if we had the benefit of again, looking or being in the world as moral agents, as human beings, right? Able to see the humanity in someone who does not necessarily look like they do, but they're able to recognize that they are like them. And they could have come up with a very different outcome simply by looking at the world from a very different perspective, right? So so we have to ask, well, was it necessary to do that? And we can look at a number of things that have happened throughout history from that same vantage point, to where in this attempt to try to compete for what is understood to be scarce resources, that we find a way of excusing certain types of behavior that are not excusable, right? You're attempting to justify things that are not justifiable, right? And it does, again, come from this, again, way of looking at the world in a manner in which competition is seen as being what defines the dynamics of how the world works. And I don't believe that. And I think we have enough examples which would point to that not being a legitimate way of looking at the world. Now there's sort of a perspective or a set of attitudes which would point you in that direction, or again point you in a very different direction depending on kind of what your frame of reference is. And I think this is very much a part of what Bill talks about is if you assume that there is enough for everyone, right? You assume abundance, which is what he talks about. This is the abundance, that word comes up over and over and over again in the book. Then you won't find it necessary to do, the kinds of things that one who assumes that things are scarce finds it necessary to do. If your assumption is that there is not enough for everybody, then you're going to do a very different set of, you're going to follow a very different course of action. And really that's the rub. That's the key, is where do you start from? What do you assume? Like, what are your beginning assumptions? Now, if we take nature as an example, you actually have to work to prevent nature from being productive. Like, you have to work hard to prevent nature from to prevent nature from producing, if it's intact. Once you've sort of taken it apart and it's been degraded, then it's a bit more of a challenge. But even in that state, it still is capable of producing, because that's what it does. It's constantly trying to reproduce itself. It's constantly trying to replicate itself. It's constantly trying to take whatever the available energies are and then convert that into some kind of yield, because it wants to live, right? So can you take that essential quality of natural systems, and can we utilize that in a way that is able to produce benefit for us, and not only us, but for those that we come into contact with? Because again, ultimately we realize, as I said before, I'm safe if you're safe. I'm taken care of if you're taken care of. I'm in danger if you're in danger. And ultimately I think we really have to be in the world, we have to see the world from that standpoint. Does that answer your question? I don't know. Oh, and then, yeah, go ahead, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Sidi.
Grazie Rhamis, e volevo chiederti l'ultima considerazione in merito a questa parola competizione. Può esistere una competizione positiva e una competizione negativa? Prendo ad esempio lo sport che ha tanti valori. A seconda di come si legge questa parola può esserci, io non vorrei esprimere giudizi perché non ho pregiudizi, per cui cerco solo un confronto su questa parola e credo che sia molto importante parlare di questo.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you brought that up, because actually it brings to mind another reference. So I'm a sports fan. Don't judge me. I haven't lived in America in almost 10 years, and I still, it's American football season, it's American football season, so I still watch American football. So, which I don't know, part of me is quite shocked. I still watch that game, but I think there are many qualities, like many. I think, many good qualities that come from competition, a type of competition that drives us to improve ourselves, right, to become better than we are. This is, I think this is indicative of something that's called, that's referred to as like the anti-fragile principle, anti-fragility. There's a gentleman named Nassim Nicholas Taleb, who talks about this idea of anti-fragility, that there are things in the world that actually benefit from, every so often being put under a certain amount of stress or experiencing a certain amount of sort of load, is because it forces you to respond to the load. So for example, if you want to get stronger, right, if you want your body to be stronger, you have to lift weights, right? You have to actually sort of stress it a bit because it forces the body to respond to the new load, right? So your muscles hypertrophy, they grow, right? You become more sturdy, your body gets strong because it's under a type of stress. If you want to become, you want to increase your endurance, you have to run. You have to run distances, or you have to kind of raise your heart rate for a certain amount of time so that you actually build your volumetric capacity in terms of your breathing and your respiration. So there are some benefits to being put in situations, and again, being put in the midst of competition that actually makes you better than you are. I think the moment that you're competing in a way that causes you to destroy someone or something else, that becomes problematic. So there's a reference that just came to mind. And I know this reference, it's mentioned in the Quran, right? And this was actually a mention about sort of the disputes that exist between the different religious communities, right? The people that have different beliefs, and what people were told to do is to compete with one another in good works. Compete with one another in good works. So the competition is to see who can do the most good things, not who can compete in a manner that makes the folks that you're competing with worse than they are. Not by undermining them, but by actually showing how much better you are by doing the most good. It's a very different set of, that's a very different basis upon which your competition is based. It's actually to see who can be better than the other person by doing the most good, right? Rather than trying to, again, undermine those who you're competing against. So in that sense, yeah, competition can be good because you want to see who's the best, right? By showing how good you are by doing the most good. It's a very different way of being in the world. It's a very different perspective, right? And then ultimately, what's said in the book is, God says, I will decide, I will explain the things about which you used to dispute with one another, right? So that's not for you to figure out, right? I'll tell you what it was. I'll straighten that out. But for now, compete with each other in doing the most good. Right. Does that make sense? Right. So I think in that sense, that's where competition becomes it. So the idea is, go out there and whatever is within your capacity to generate as many beneficial outcomes as possible, do it. And then maybe you'll see that somebody else was actually able to do better than you. And then you're like, oh, wait a minute, that guy did. Okay, I'm going to go change it up. So you kind of make adjustments and iterate through to the next design that's hopefully better than what it was you did before. And then in that way, everybody's made better because you have a better example to refer to. And then that raises everybody up. Prego.
Hi, Rhamis. Salam alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Thank you for this brilliant session. And
There you go.
okay, I'm very interested in permaculture design, and I love to Mollison as social designer. And so my question is about your vision. Yes, about the best social structure that can apply the permaculture theories. And so if you think about the future, in 40 years we will be 10 billions. You will have gray or white hair. I'll be part of the soil. Okay, and so if in your vision you think that the best social structure is the basic family, rural family, cooperation with neighbors, small town, what will for a big city, and so on. Thank you, Rhamis.
Grazie. Prego. Well, one of the things I would point to as far as sort of social organization is concerned, there's a chapter in the book, chapter 14, which is alternatives for a strategies for an alternative global nation. If I remember correctly, if I remember that's the title. So, thank you. Strategies for an Alternative Nation. Thank you. You spent 2 years, translating the book. You should know it back to front. Yeah. In that chapter, which is sometimes called Invisible Structures, Bill's outlined a number of options for being able to organize the activities of people. I mean, really, that's what that chapter is about. It's taking the same principles that were talked about in the previous 13 chapters as they applied to sort of natural systems, and then applying that to human systems. So we look at legal strategies, again, social strategies, financial strategies. There's all the ways in which people can be organized. Probably one of the best options that he mentions in that last chapter is the one covering bioregional organizations. So if you were to look in the book, I don't know how many of you guys have a book. Maybe I'll see about trying to pull that up. So he has something called bioregional organizations, where the actual physical location where people are situated, that forms the basis of the community and the social organization. And there are a number of functions and jobs that come out of one, with people identifying with, again, the physical region from which they come. So I just want to maybe mention some of those, and then you can see, perhaps some of the possibilities for creating social structures which will create better outcomes for a community. So, okay, here we go. So here's the old cover. So if we go all the way down to the end, yeah. So here we are. So chapter 14. So this is the chapter covering bioregional organizations. Let me see if I can make this a little bigger. Here we go. So so a bioregional association or organization is an association of the residents of a natural and identifiable region. Right? So this is sometimes defined by a watershed. It's sometimes by remnant or existing tribal or language boundaries, at times by town boundaries, suburban streets or districts, and at times by some combination of all those factors. So Bill actually talks about how he had formed or was a part of a bioregional organization in it was either Australia or Tasmania, I think Australia. And here are some of the things that were covered by the bioregional organization. Okay, yeah, so here, it was in New South Wales, which is in Australia. It's where Jeff lives. So here he's explained some of the categories that would make up the bioregional organization. So the first one here, food and food support systems. The next would be shelter and buildings. The third here is livelihoods and support services. The fourth is information, media, communication, and research. Here, the fifth is community and security. And in mentioning security, you know, he defines security in a very specific way, and it has a great deal to do here. You can see here. Security here means a cooperative neighborhood and ample sustainable resources for people. Again, the understanding that security is when everybody has enough of what they need, right? That's what security is. And then next, the next category is social life, health services, future trends, transport services, and then what he calls appendices, which would include maps and publications of the bioregion, really just the information and the data that applies to the region that then informs the decision making. Now, everything that was mentioned there sounds like what a good government does. I mean, that's exactly what government's supposed to do, right? And as to whether or not government is able to provide that for you, you know, one needs to ask, well, if they're not doing those jobs, why aren't they doing those jobs? What's preventing them from providing those things? But, you know, outside of whether or not government has either the capability or the willingness to provide those services, these are the things that if you can, you know, find like-minded people that would like to begin to create the circumstances which will allow for everyone to have access to these things. This is a way of being able to organize an effort. So, you know, in the book, he fleshes out all of the different functions under each of the categories that would need to be fulfilled. So I think the great thing about this is, you know, there's work for everybody. You know, there's something for everyone, right? As we say in, you know, in the Bay Area in California, what you have to do is you have to get in where you fit in, right? Get in where you fit in. You find where do you see yourself being of best use? Where do you see as being close to your interests or your talents, right? Or your skill set, and then, you know, hopefully there's an opportunity for you to be able to put those things to use. Hopefully there's an opportunity for you to offer whatever it is that you do for the greater good. And I think this is probably one of the better sort of structural or organizational structures that can be used in order to begin to organize a community. And again, the idea is that what defines the community is the physical region itself, understanding that those are the resources, and that is the place that actually provides you with a chance to actually live, you know, a decent, dignified life. The question is, how can you make best use of the resources that are in that place? And then how can you create opportunities to work with other people? Because, I tell people this all the time, if you think you're going to do any of these things by yourself, you will break yourself. Like, you will make yourself crazy. I guarantee you. So if there's a desire, if there's really a desire to do, you know, what's being discussed in the book here, you have to create a community. You really have to create a community. And I think this is a great way to begin imagining what that community could look like. But there are other suggestions here too, in terms of, you know, say legal strategies that could be utilized, of, you know, financing strategies, you know, anything from credit unions to, you know, the use of trust structures like community land trusts or development trusts. There's, you know, an opportunity to create, you know, nonprofit organizations that can then take on donations, which can then be directed towards the work. You can create sort of an ecosystem of for-profit and non-profit entities that allows for you to be able to make use of whatever monies that you're bringing in, which would prevent it from, again, going to, well, I'm not going to say, I don't want to get anybody in trouble. But it's a way of, again, better circulating the funds, better circulating resources to, again, create outcomes for your community. And again, all of those things, I think, are really well discussed and highlighted in that last chapter. And I'm really happy it's available in Italian. I'm really happy about that. Is that good?
Hi, Rhamis.
How are you doing?
Hi. So, as you know, Buckminster Fuller, he was another genius, was an architect, an engineer, very similar to Bill Mollison way to think about big picture. And he said that to change things at scale, it is important not just to fight the existing reality, but it's very important creating a new model, a complete new model, right? Yeah. And permaculture has a big potential to do that. But of course, to create a big model, a new model, is important to have a holistic approach, which goes from the small scale to the big scale. It is also very important to have an interdisciplinary approach. So it's important the collaboration from government, universities, farmers, and private people. As permaculture is not recognized yet as a science in academia level, how do you think it's possible to join this certificate?
Actually, thank you for bringing that up. And I think this is a very important point, because part of what needs to be figured out with a lot of this, and I think this is probably one of the biggest, I think, deficiencies in permaculture, is how it's kind of marketed itself. I mean, permaculture has been around for almost 40 years, and people still are not clear on what permaculture is. So the fact that there's still questions about how it's defined is a problem. I think, you know, one of the things that I think one of the reasons why that is, you know, Bill sought to make sure that permaculture was not sort of, it was very decentralized. He didn't want, you know, he didn't want it to be controlled by any, say, one person or one group of people. So in that sense, it kind of has very anarchic, you know, or like it's kind of like anarchy, in some sense, is kind of a part of what it was he was attempting to try to implement in a kind of in a practical manner, in that he didn't want it to be necessarily dominated by, again, any one group of people. And that's not to say that he was against order. That's not it at all. And I think he very clearly, makes this point in the introduction to chapter 14. And he says here, if I can, I just want to read this very quickly. And then I want to get back to what it was that you had, the point you were making about how can we get some of these ideas into kind of more official circles and kind of seen as having more legitimacy. How can we have a more holistic approach? So he says here, we know how to solve every food, clean energy, and sensible shelter problem in every climate. We have already invented and tested every necessary technique and technical device and have access to all the biological material that we could ever use. And this is the point here. The tragic reality is that very few sustainable systems are designed or applied by those who hold power, and the reason for this is obvious and simple. To let people arrange their own food, energy, and shelter is to lose economic and political control over them. So just, right, to allow for people, or to let people arrange their own food, energy, and shelter is to lose economic and political control over them, which is, I think it's a very powerful statement. I think it's actually very accurate. But I think at this point, because you have other factors that are impacting or that need to be taken into consideration, right? Aside from, who's got the power and who does it. Like, we're now at a point where we're talking about existential threats, right, to life on the planet. And that there are things that we simply need to do in order for life to be sort of halfway pleasant or halfway viable, on Earth, without, again, conflict, without war, without, disease and pestilence and famine and refugees. There are just certain things that have to be done out of a sense of, again, an enlightened self-interest. And I think one of the ways that we have to do that is we really need to be able to speak the same language as, people in government, or even the same language, or be able to communicate to people that are part of sort of corporate bodies. And we have to be willing to at least dialogue. We're not necessarily going to see eye to eye with these people, at least not immediately. But I've always said, and there have been other people that have said this, that eventually all of those people, they have to end up where we are. They have to. Like, just simply as a practical matter. Because who cares how much money, fine, you have X number of billionaires on the planet. Who cares how much money you have if you live in a place that nobody's able to live? To where the vast majority of the planet is they're constantly in danger. And by virtue of all these people being constantly in danger, that means even if you're like, the winners out of that arrangement, you're not safe. You're not safe. At the end of the day, you can't kill everybody. You can't. And even if you could, like, you want to stay in a place where whatever it was you had to do in order to accomplish that, you want to live in that place? So at the end of the day, as a practical matter, they've got to end up where we are. So, we have to be prepared to be able to make the case. Now, I think some of the things that we currently have available to us that will allow us to begin doing that is, I know the term permaculture doesn't necessarily have much, if any, presence in academia in terms of, are there academic studies, You know, are there things that have been done, peer-reviewed papers, all of these things? Permaculture, no. But there is a term that can be used. I'm sorry, I don't mean to disrupt the shop. Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you. Wait, who said that? Okay, thank you, okay. So you already knew. Yeah, so I would recommend people look up the term agroecology or agricultural ecology. Okay? I would highly recommend looking up agricultural ecology, and you'll find probably, you know, there's probably a good 20, 25 years of academic research that's been done. You can find a lot of journal articles. One of the most valuable references that you could refer to that specifically mentions agroecology is it was a UN report that was produced about 6 or 7 years ago by the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food. It's a Belgian gentleman named Olivier de Schutter. And in this paper, they wanted to identify the best options for meeting the needs of the anticipated 9.2 billion people that are supposed to be on Earth by 2050. And in the course of doing this research, it was found or settled that agroecology would be the best option that would be able to meet that need. So, you know, this was, of course, an attempt to try to address the issues that arose from, here we go. So this is the UN report. This is one of the press releases that came when that report was released in 2011. So here, small-scale farmers can double food production within 10 years in critical regions by using ecological methods, a new UN report shows, based on an extensive review of the recent scientific literature. Right? The study calls for a fundamental shift towards agroecology as a way to boost food production and improve the situation of the poorest. Now, in many of the papers written about that were written on agroecology, permaculture is mentioned specifically as being one of the design systems that would fall underneath the umbrella of agroecology. So this is it's a great reference if anybody is really questioning the legitimacy of permaculture as a design science or something that deserves to be paid attention to. Just simply refer them to agroecology, and then that will hopefully address some of that. Yeah.
Io volevo fare una breve riflessione su quello che sulla competizione che avevamo detto prima. Magari mi sbaglio, però credo che Mollison, quando ha scritto il libro, abbia parlato di come sia l'uomo che deve interagire con la natura e non contro. Perché parto da un piccolo presupposto: se esiste un'agricoltura deve esistere un agricoltore. In natura non esistono agricoltori e agricoltura. Il lupo non alleva il cervo che mangia e la scimmia non pianta gli alberi da frutto di cui si ciba, così come la cavalletta e tutti gli esseri viventi. Quindi quello che diceva Mollison, secondo me, mi sbaglierò forse, però era che l'agricoltore deve conoscere ed evitare le situazioni di conflitto. Nel senso, se io metto il noce vicino al melo, ho la certezza che quel melo morirà. Se metto il pomodoro dopo la melanzana, ho la certezza che il pomodoro si ammalerà. Quindi questa è la mia riflessione. poi non so se è giusta o sbagliata. E ho una domanda brevissima. L'agricoltura oggi è arrivata si dice 4.0, quindi un'agricoltura che utilizza tantissimi droni, idroponica, aeroponica, un'agricoltura molto sofisticata che utilizza però tantissimi input. Quello che io vorrei chiederle è, secondo lei, come può un sistema come l'agroecologia o la permacultura lavorare insieme a questa agricoltura 4.0?
Can you just better define the agriculture 4.0? I just wanted to be clear that I understand what you meant there.
Sì, è un'agricoltura che utilizza le macchine in modo quasi totale. L'idroponica è supportata dalla macchina raccoglitrice, l'idroponica supportata dalla macchina che fa le analisi del terreno, l'aeroponica con tutti i sistemi in logico.
Okay, so I guess just to be clear, there's nothing in permaculture that is averse to the use of technology. I think just so we're clear. I mean, we're not. Bill wasn't advocating that we become like Luddites. That we just completely, all technology is bad. That's not what he was saying at all. And now that I said that, I want to go back to one of the slides that I had been discussing here. And this goes to what I'll call the design or the practical design considerations of permaculture, which actually come out of the principles that we had talked about. Okay, so there are three main points that all of the principles can sort of be funneled into with regard to what you were just mentioning. So the first practical design point would be for us to create systems, right? That the systems that are constructed by us, they should last as long as possible and take as little maintenance as possible, take least maintenance, right? So this is something that will provide a very high return on investment, right? So the work that we put in gives us, again, a very high return. That's one. The second point is that ideally the systems that we constructed, right, which are primarily fueled by the sun, which would mean that we would need to use, natural elements. In this case, things that photosynthesize, right? In this case, it would be, plants, trees. These systems, which are ideally fueled by the sun, should produce not only their own needs, but the needs of the people creating or controlling. I don't like the word controlling. I'll say managing them. The people creating those systems and managing them. Thus, they are sustainable as they sustain both themselves and those who construct them. So in that sense, this is an example of the whole idea of reinvesting the surplus. So they're able to produce enough for themselves to survive, and then whatever extra is reinvested, right, into the system, which would include those who are using using that place as a habitat, right? So, a tree, for instance, it's a great example of what a tree does. A tree uses as much energy as it needs in order to, create wood and lignin and all those things and bark and leaves, and then the extra energy is fruit, right? You can use the fruit without damaging the tree, right? And it's able to do that for year after year after year once it establishes, provided that you have certain conditions that exist for the tree to maintain that function. The third point is that we can use energy to construct these systems, providing that in their lifetime, they store or conserve more energy than was used to construct them or to maintain them. Right? So again, the energy relationship is really important to make sure we've got well defined. So so we want a very high return on investment in terms of the energy that's used. So for example, I was talking about using an earth moving machine, right? So using a tractor or a bulldozer, for instance. Now, if we're using a tractor or a bulldozer, which is obviously powered by fossil fuel, ideally I would use those machines to create a structure or an arrangement that is effectively permanent. So if I use a dozer or an excavator to create a terrace, for instance, if I create a terrace and then I plant that terrace to trees that, you know, if you're talking about olive trees or a chestnut tree or a bunya pine or something that could be productive literally for hundreds if not thousands of years, that's a good use of energy. That's a good use of energy. I was one person who using a machine that basically is doing the work of hundreds of people for a relatively short period of time to create something that will be productive for hundreds if not thousands of years. That's a good use of energy, because what you're likely to see is that you're going to recover whatever energy you used in constructing that system and then go far beyond that. Same thing if you use the machine to create, you know, say a large reservoir, a pond to capture water. Like the amount of use that you'll get out of the pond, given the amount of energy that you use to create it, that's a good use of energy. And then all the other things you mentioned, you know, using drones to monitor, you know, crops, for instance, to see, you know, what kind of, you know, what's the situation with the soil moisture there? You know, do you get some indication as to the soil quality or, you know, stress on plants or what have you? All of that's great because it provides you with information. You know, it provides you with data. The question is, how are you using the data? How are you using the information? Because you could drown yourself in information and the information doesn't do you any good. Or even worse is that you end up misinterpreting the information and then you read it wrongly and then you end up doing a lot of the wrong thing, right? So at that point, the information really doesn't end up helping you. If anything, it ends up hurting you. The key is being able to sort of have sort of your design eye and your design mind trained to the point to where you can take all of the information and all of the tools and utilize them in the best way possible. I mean, that's the most difficult thing. So I guess probably to summarize that point, here's some questions to think about, because this again comes back to the point of you know, the discussion about energy, right? The discussion about having the ability to do work, right? The first question we should think about is, what kind of work is actually worth doing, right? You have the capacity to work, right? What is actually worth doing? What will produce the best outcome, right? So once you've been able to recognize or highlight what work is worth doing, the second question is, what resources are required to perform this work? Right? What are the things that will allow you to actually produce, to do or to perform these tasks? And then lastly, what must be done to gain access to the resources which will allow for this work to be performed? Right? So what kind of work is worth doing? Right? What are the resources required to perform the work? And then what do you have to do in order to gain access to those resources? Right, so those I think those are three very practical things to keep in mind when we're talking about this whole process of design. Okay. Thank you. Grazie.
Quando nel 2010 per la prima volta mi sono approcciato alla permacultura, non ero in Italia, ero all'estero. Chiaramente, come chiunque che si approccia alla permacultura, ho iniziato ad ascoltare tutto ciò che dicevano, chi diceva, cosa diceva e come lo diceva. E dal 2010 al 2018 sono passati 8 anni e non ho mai incontrato nessuno che sia in grado di spiegare la permacultura come fa Rhamis Kent. È un qualcosa di eccezionale. Non ho mai veramente incontrato nessuno. E riuscire ad esprimere concetti che non sono così semplici, ma sono abbastanza complessi, in un modo così chiaro come lo fa Rhamis, do you want to leave? Come lo fa Rhamis, non l'ho mai trovato. Chiudiamo questa prima sessione. Grazie Rhamis, grazie mille. Chiudiamo questa prima sessione e riprendiamo alle 3 del pomeriggio. Vi consiglio di arrivare 15 minuti in anticipo in modo tale da ripristinare la questione dei microfonini e dell'audio. Il borgo antico di Bari conserva tanti preziosi ristorantini e localini dove è possibile avere pranzo, quindi io vi auguro buon pranzo e ci vediamo alle 15. Grazie.